night was merciless. A sharp wind swept across the Montana plains, carrying flakes of snow that stung like shards of glass against the skin. The Crawford family sat huddled together on the wagon, their breaths clouding the air, their silence heavy with exhaustion and unspoken fear. It was 1897, and the promise of a new beginning had brought them thousands of miles from Boston. But as their weary eyes settled on the silhouette of their new home, hope felt like a fragile thing, ready to break with the next gust of wind. The house stood alone in the white wilderness, a dark figure against the storm. A two-story farmhouse, sagging under the weight of years, its weather-beaten boards groaning as if burdened by memories too heavy to bear. A single shutter flapped wildly, striking the wall in a rhythm that sounded almost like a warning. James Crawford held the reins tight, his knuckles pale, his jaw clenched. He had once been a man of certainty, a banker who prided himself on order and stability. But after losing his job and reputation, all that certainty had scattered like ash. This house, lonely, battered, and cold, was all he could afford to give his family. Beside him, Margaret's eyes glistened as she stared at the farmhouse. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, pressing their youngest daughter closer, trying to shelter her from both the cold and the sight before them. Her heart ached with doubt. This wasn't the warm new beginning she had pictured when James promised Montana would be their salvation. This place felt forgotten, abandoned. Hungry to lie in the back of the wagon, the two older children shivered beneath heavy blankets. They whispered to each other, their voices trembling. To them, the house looked alive, like something breathing in the dark, waiting for them to enter. One of them asked quietly, "Do we really have to stay here?" But their mother hushed them quickly, though she could not quiet the fear in her own heart. The wagon creaked to a stop. The horses snorted, stamping their hooves as if uneasy themselves. James jumped down into the snow, the crunch of his boots loud in the otherwise dead silence. He lit the lantern, the flame flickering uncertainly in the wind, casting long shadows over the ground. As he raised it toward the porch, the light revealed more details. Splintered steps, cracked windows, and the skeletal remains of a tree whose branches clawed against the upper floor like bony fingers. James forced a breath, steadying himself. "It's not much," he said softly, almost to himself, "but it's ours." He wanted to sound strong. He wanted to believe it, but Margaret caught the strain in his voice. She knew the weight he carried, the shame of failure, the desperate need to prove he could rebuild. And though she loved him, she couldn't quiet the gnawing dread that pressed against her chest. When the door finally creaked open, the sound echoed through the night like a scream. The air that spilled out was cold, stale, and heavy. Inside, the walls seemed to sigh, as though they had been waiting. The children clutched each other tighter. Margaret hesitated, her body tense, every instinct screaming to turn back. And yet, with no other choice, the Crawfords stepped across the threshold. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that the Montana winter was not the only thing waiting to test them. "Well, here we are," James announced, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he pulled the horses to a stop. "Our new beginning." From the wagon, Elizabeth Crawford pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the isolated homestead with uncertainty. Beside her, 14-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Thomas peered out, their expressions mirroring their mother's apprehension. "It's so quiet," Emma whispered. "That's the sound of peace," James replied with forced optimism. "No city noise, no neighbors arguing, just us in nature." Thomas clutched his mother's arm. "It looks scary." "Nonsense," James said, jumping down from the driver's seat and extending his hand to help his family. "It's just unfamiliar. You'll grow to love it." The journey from Boston had been arduous. 2 weeks of travel by train to the nearest town, followed by 3 days in the wagon James had purchased with the last of their savings. Elizabeth had tried to maintain a brave face for the children, but as the towns grew smaller and farther apart, she'd found her resolve weakening. Now standing before this isolated farmhouse with miles of wilderness stretching in every direction, she wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. "It'll be warmer inside," James assured them, noticing Elizabeth's hesitation. The land agent promised the chimney is in good working order. As they trudged through knee-deep snow toward the house, Elizabeth noticed something odd about the structure. Certain windows had been boarded up from the inside, visible through the glass of the outer panes. Why would someone cover windows from within? James, she began, but he was already striding ahead, eager to prove the worth of his investment. As the family approached the house, the wind carried a distant howl that made them pause. James laughed nervously. Just wolves? They won't come near the house. Are there many wolves in these parts? Elizabeth asked, drawing Thomas closer. The land agent mentioned them, but said they keep to the deep forest most times. Nothing to worry about. James fumbled with the key, his fingers stiff with cold. The door swung open with a protesting creak, revealing darkness beyond. James stepped in first, striking a match to light the lantern he'd carried from the wagon. The wavering flame illuminated a dusty foyer, casting long shadows up the staircase that dominated the entrance. The interior of the farmhouse was cold and musty, years of neglect evident in every corner. James lit a lantern, illuminating the dust-covered furniture left behind by the previous owners. Elizabeth ran a finger across a table, leaving a clean line in the thick dust. "Why would someone abandon a perfectly good home?" she asked. James shrugged. The land agent mentioned something about the previous family deciding farming wasn't for them. Too isolated, I suppose, but the price was right. And with my severance, we can make this work. "It's so cold," Emma complained, hugging herself. "I'll get a fire going," James promised. "Thomas, come help me bring in our supplies. Emma, see if you can find some lamps or candles in the kitchen." As the family separated to their tasks, Elizabeth remained in the foyer, her gaze drawn to a faded portrait hanging on the wall. The painting depicted a family, mother, father, and 2 children, posed stiffly in front of what appeared to be this very house. The faces were somber, the eyes somehow unsettling even in the poor light. "The previous owners, I presume," she murmured to herself, leaning closer to read the small plaque on the frame. "The Blackwood family, 1878. Something about the image disturbed her. Perhaps the unsmiling faces, or the way the mother's hand gripped her daughter's shoulder with white-knuckled intensity. Elizabeth quickly turned away, focusing instead on helping James bring their belongings inside. That night, huddled together for warmth around the newly lit fireplace, the family ate a simple meal of bread and dried meat. Outside, the wind howled, finding every crack and crevice in the old house, creating an eerie symphony of whistles and moans. "I don't like it here," Thomas said, his voice small. "Hush now," Elizabeth soothed. "It's just a house. We'll make it our home." Emma, always the more adventurous of the 2 children, was already planning explorations for the morning. "Do you think there are any other children nearby?" James exchanged a glance with Elizabeth. "The nearest neighbors are 5 miles away. The Hendersons, I believe, they have a boy about your age, Thomas." 5 miles, Emma's face fell. "We have each other," Elizabeth reminded them. "And once spring comes, we'll be busy with the farm. Your father has grand plans for this place." James nodded enthusiastically. "The soil here is rich, better than anything back east. We'll plant wheat, maybe some corn. There's an apple orchard that needs pruning, but it should produce well. By fall, we'll have put by enough to see us through next winter comfortably." "And the livestock?" Elizabeth asked, remembering the empty barn they'd passed on their arrival. "I'll go to town next week, see about purchasing a milk cow, some chickens, maybe a pig or 2 if the price is right." Emma picked at her bread. "What about school?" James's smile faltered slightly. "Well, that's something we'll need to adapt to. The nearest school is in town, too far for daily travel. Your mother will continue your lessons here." Elizabeth nodded, though the thought of being solely responsible for the children's education added another worry to her growing list. In Boston, both children had attended proper schools. Emma had shown particular promise in mathematics and literature. Would she be able to nurture those talents here so far from books and other minds? As they prepared for bed, arranging their bedrolls near the fire until proper sleeping arrangements could be made. A strange scratching sound came from the walls. James dismissed it as mice or the house settling, but Thomas insisted it sounded like fingernails dragging across wood. "It's an old house, son," James said firmly. "Old houses make noises." The family slept fitfully that first night, the strange surroundings and unfamiliar sounds keeping them on edge. Elizabeth found herself waking at every creak and groan, straining to identify each noise in the darkness. That night, as the family slept, Elizabeth woke to the sound of footsteps overhead. The upper floor was still uninhabited, filled with the previous owner's abandoned belongings that they hadn't yet sorted through. She nudged James awake. "Someone's upstairs," she whispered. James listened. The footsteps moved from one end of the ceiling to the other, deliberate and unhurried. "Stay here with the children," he said, reaching for the rifle he'd kept nearby. Elizabeth clutched his arm. "Be careful." James climbed the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath his weight. The second floor was pitch black, the moonlight unable to penetrate the boards that had been nailed over the windows. He raised his lantern, casting long shadows across the hallway. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" The footsteps had stopped the moment he began climbing the stairs. Now only silence greeted him as he moved from room to room, finding nothing but sheet-covered furniture and trunks. No signs of an intruder, no open windows or doors. When he returned downstairs, Elizabeth was sitting up wide-eyed. "There's no one there," he assured her. "The wind must have been moving something across the floor." Elizabeth didn't look convinced. "It sounded like footsteps. James, human footsteps." "Well, whoever you heard, they're gone now. Try to get some sleep. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow." But sleep didn't come easily for Elizabeth that night, nor for many nights afterward. The next morning brought clear skies and sunshine that revealed the true state of the property. The farmhouse stood in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest with fields that had gone years ago stretching behind it. A weathered barn listed slightly to one side and various outbuildings dotted the property, all in need of repair. James surveyed it all with determination. "It's going to take work, but by summer we'll have this place producing again." In the harsh light of day, Elizabeth could see just how much work lay ahead of them. The house itself, while structurally sound, showed years of neglect. Paint peeled from the exterior walls, shutters hung crookedly from several windows, and the porch sagged dangerously on one side. The fields behind the house were overgrown with weeds, the soil hard and compacted from years without tilling. "Let's focus on making the house livable first," Elizabeth suggested, trying to hide her dismay at the enormity of the task. "Then we can worry about the fields." James nodded distractedly, his eyes fixed on the distant tree line. "I thought I saw something moving at the edge of the forest." Elizabeth followed his gaze, but saw nothing. "Probably just deer or another animal." "Yes, of course," James agreed, though he continued staring for a moment longer before shaking himself and turning back to the house. "You're right about priorities. House first, then outbuildings, then fields." While James inspected the barn and outbuildings, Elizabeth and the children began the arduous task of cleaning the house. They opened windows to air out the musty rooms, swept away years of dust, and removed the sheets from furniture to assess what could be salvaged. Emma discovered a trunk of old clothing in what would become her bedroom. Dresses and petticoats from at least 20 years earlier, preserved remarkably well despite the passage of time. "Look, Mother," she called, holding up a blue dress with intricate beadwork. "Isn't it beautiful?" Elizabeth examined the garment, running her fingers over the fine stitching. "It is. I wonder why anyone would leave such lovely things behind." "Can I keep some of them?" Emma asked. "They might fit me with a few alterations." Elizabeth hesitated. There was something unsettling about wearing the clothes of people who had abandoned them so completely. "Let's set them aside for now. Once we're more settled, we can decide what to do with them." In the kitchen, Elizabeth discovered a journal wedged behind a cupboard. The leather-bound book had no name inscribed, but the yellowed pages were filled with neat handwriting. She tucked it away to read later, not wanting to be distracted from the day's work. Upstairs, Emma and Thomas sorted through the abandoned belongings, setting aside anything that might be useful. In what would become Emma's room, they found a trunk filled with women's clothing from at least 20 years earlier. "These are beautiful," Emma said, holding up a blue dress with intricate beadwork. "I wonder why they left them behind." Thomas, meanwhile, had discovered something far more interesting in his designated room. A small door about 3 feet high built into the wall behind where his bed would go. "Emma, look," he called. Emma joined him, eyeing the little door curiously. "What do you think it is?" "Let's find out." Thomas reached for the handle, but Emma stopped him. "We should tell Father first." Thomas pouted. "He's busy and it's my room." Before Emma could protest further, Thomas pulled the door open. Behind it was a crawl space, dark and narrow, that seemed to extend deep into the wall. "It must go between the walls," Emma whispered, peering into the darkness. "Like a secret passage." Thomas leaned forward, trying to see further inside. "I think there's something in there." "Don't you dare go in," Emma warned, suddenly uneasy. "Let's tell Father about it." But Thomas was already squeezing through the small opening, disappearing into the darkness before Emma could stop him. "Thomas," she hissed, "come back right now." Seconds stretched into a minute with no response. Emma was about to call for her parents when Thomas's face suddenly appeared in the doorway, pale and wide-eyed. "There's another room," he whispered, "and someone's been living in it." Emma didn't believe him until he showed her the evidence. A small lantern still containing oil, matches, and a tin plate with the remnants of food that hadn't been there long enough to rot completely. "We have to tell Father," Emma insisted. Thomas nodded, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear. Together, they rushed downstairs to find James, who was returning from his inspection of the barn. "Father, there's a hidden room in the walls," Thomas exclaimed. "Someone's been living there." James frowned, clearly skeptical. "Show me." The children led James upstairs to Thomas's room, where he examined the small door with growing concern. After lighting a lantern, he insisted on investigating the crawl space himself, instructing the children to wait with their mother. Elizabeth listened to Thomas's discovery with alarm. "A hidden room? And you say someone's been using it recently?" "There was food, Mother," Emma confirmed. "Not old food, but recent." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. The footsteps she'd heard last night, the scratching in the walls. Suddenly, these sounds took on a more sinister meaning. What if someone had been living in their house without their knowledge? The thought was deeply unsettling. When James returned, his expression was grim. "There is indeed a small chamber between the walls. And yes, it appears someone has been using it recently." "But who?" Elizabeth asked. "And are they still here?" James shook his head. "I explored as much of the space as I could. It's cramped but extends quite a distance between the walls. There's no sign of anyone there now." "But what?" Elizabeth prompted. "There are scratches on the inside of the walls. Deep grooves as if someone or something was trying to claw their way out." By evening, James had thoroughly investigated the hidden room, which turned out to be a small chamber tucked between the walls, accessible only through the crawl space in Thomas's room. The evidence suggested someone had indeed been using the space recently, but there was no sign of them now. "Probably a drifter," James concluded. "Someone who took shelter here while the house was abandoned. Nothing to worry about. They're long gone now." Elizabeth wasn't convinced. "What if they come back? We're miles from any neighbors." "I'll nail this door shut," James promised. "And I'll keep the rifle handy. But I'm telling you, they won't be back. They'll have moved once they realized the house was sold." That night, James made good on his promise, sealing the small door with several nails driven deep into the frame. But as the family ate dinner downstairs, Thomas kept glancing toward the ceiling. "What's wrong, Thomas?" Elizabeth asked. "I keep thinking about the person in the walls," he admitted. "What if they can't get out now?" "There's no one in the walls," James said firmly. "And if there was, they'd have other ways out." Houses like this are full of nooks and crannies. Elizabeth noticed James's gaze flicker to the walls as he spoke, betraying his own uncertainty. Despite his reassurances, he kept the rifle propped against his chair throughout dinner. As if to confirm his words, the scratching sound they'd heard the previous night returned. This time from behind the kitchen wall. James immediately rose and pressed his ear to the wooden panels. "Mice," he declared after listening for a moment. "We'll need to set traps." Emma exchanged a glance with Thomas. "Those don't sound like mice to me," she whispered when James stepped away. Thomas nodded, his face pale. "Mice don't have fingernails." "That's enough," Elizabeth interjected, seeing the fear building in her children. "Your father said it's mice, and that's what it is. Now finish your dinner." But later, as she washed the dishes, Elizabeth found herself listening intently to the sounds within the walls. The scratching had a rhythm to it, almost deliberate, moving from one section of wall to another as if following the family's movements through the house. Mice might scratch, but not with such purpose. That night, Elizabeth insisted Thomas sleep in their room, claiming he looked feverish. The boy didn't argue, clearly relieved not to be left alone. Emma, however, maintained her independent streak, insisting she was perfectly fine in her own room despite the strange noises. "I'm not a child, Mother," she said firmly. "And besides, we don't even know if anyone was really living in that space. It could have been an animal that brought in the food." Elizabeth didn't press the issue, though she made sure Emma's door remained open and that the girl had a candle burning beside her bed. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Elizabeth finally had a chance to examine the journal she'd found. Sitting by the fire, she opened the leather cover and began to read. The first entry was dated 1878, nearly 20 years earlier. May 12, 1878. "We arrived at our new home today. John is convinced this land will yield better than our previous farm in Ohio. The children are excited about the adventure, though I confess I find the isolation unsettling. Our nearest neighbors, the Millers, are 5 miles east. John says, 'I'll adjust to the quiet.'" Elizabeth felt a chill of recognition at words that could have been her own. She continued reading, following the daily accounts of Sarah Blackwood, the previous homesteader's wife. The journal documented the family's struggles with the harsh Montana climate, failed crops, and increasing tensions as their fortunes dwindled. July 3, 1878. "The summer heat is oppressive. John works from dawn until dusk, determined to make this land productive. The children explore the forest edge, though I've forbidden them to venture deeper. Last night, Mary said she saw a man watching her from between the trees. Impossibly tall and thin, she said. John dismissed it as childish imagination, but I've seen how he looks toward the forest when he thinks no one is watching. August 17, 1878. Something killed 2 of our chickens last night. John found them this morning, their necks broken, but bodies otherwise untouched. He blames foxes, but there was no sign of an animal breaking into the coop. The door was open as if whatever did this simply walked in. I asked if it could have been a person, perhaps the man Mary claimed to see, but John grew angry at the suggestion. There's no one for miles, he insisted. But if that's true, why does he now lock our bedroom door at night? September 30th, 1878. The harvest is poor, far less than John anticipated. He talks of making improvements to the soil next year, but I see the worry in his eyes. Winter comes early to these mountains and our supplies are already dwindling. The children grow restless, especially Mary, who complains of scratching in her bedroom walls at night. John says it's mice, but when I suggested setting traps, he oddly refused. Best not to disturb what lives in the walls, he said, then looked startled at his own words. November 30th, 1878. The first snow has fallen earlier than expected. John is concerned about our supplies lasting through winter. The children grow more restless each day, confined to the house. Mary keeps telling me she hears someone walking in the walls at night. I tell her it's just the house settling, but sometimes I wonder. Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she turned the page. The entries continued through the winter of 1878 to 79. growing increasingly disturbed in tone. December 24th, 1878, Christmas Eve. Though there is little to celebrate, the children made decorations from paper and string, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. John has grown distant, spending hours staring at the walls. Sometimes I catch him whispering, though he denies it when questioned. Last night, I woke to find him gone from our bed. I found him in Mary's room staring at the wall where she claims to hear the scratching. He didn't acknowledge me until I touched his shoulder, and then he seemed confused, as if waking from a trance. January 15th, 1879. John found strange markings carved into the barn door this morning. He says it must be local Indians, but we've seen no sign of them since arriving. The children are sleeping poorly. Mary wakes screaming about the thin man watching her from the corner of her room. John's temper grows shorter each day. January 27th, 1879. I followed John last night. He's been disappearing for hours, claiming to check on the livestock, but the animals are all in the barn. I watched from the window as he walked to the edge of the forest and stood there talking to someone or something I couldn't see. When he returned, his clothes were covered in dirt, as if he'd been crawling through the earth. He refuses to tell me where he goes or who he speaks to. February 3rd, 1879. The supplies are running dangerously low. John had to slaughter one of the oxen today. The cold is unbearable. I keep hearing noises in the walls. Not mice or the house settling, but deliberate movements. John refuses to acknowledge it, but I know he hears it too. I've seen him staring at the walls, listening. February 10th, 1879. Mary has stopped speaking. She sits by her bedroom wall all day, occasionally pressing her ear against it and nodding as if listening to instructions. John says she's merely entertaining herself with imaginary friends, but there's something unnatural about her silence. When I try to move her away from the wall, she becomes hysterical. February 15th, 1879. I found a small door hidden behind the dresser in our bedroom today. It opens into a narrow space between the walls. John became enraged when I showed him, boarding it up immediately and forbidding me to speak of it again, but not before I saw what was inside. A collection of small peculiar objects, twisted bits of metal, bones that appeared too thin to be animal, and drawings of elongated figures with too many joints in their limbs. The entries abruptly stopped after February 18th with a frantically scribbled note. They're in the walls. They've always been in the walls. God forgive us for coming here. Elizabeth closed the journal, her heart racing. There was no explanation of what happened to the Blackwoods, no indication of why they left or where they went. She debated whether to show James the journal, but decided against it. He would only dismiss it as the imaginings of a woman driven to hysteria by isolation, just as John Blackwood apparently had. Instead, she returned the journal to its hiding place, resolving to investigate further on her own. If there was something wrong with this house, she needed to know for her family's sake. The next day brought heavy snow, confining the family to the house. James spent the day repairing broken furniture while Elizabeth continued cleaning. The children explored their new home, making a game of finding hidden features. A loose floorboard here, a false bottom in a drawer there. In the afternoon, a knock at the door startled them all. James answered it to find a middle-aged man standing on their porch, his horse stamping impatiently in the snow behind him. "Afternoon," the man said, tipping his hat. "Name's Miller, Robert Miller. I farm a few miles east of here. Saw the smoke from your chimney and thought I'd welcome you folks." James invited him in and Elizabeth quickly prepared coffee. Miller removed his hat and gloves, warming his hands by the fire as he surveyed the house. "Been a while since anyone lived here," he commented. "Not since the Blackwoods left. The land agent mentioned them," James said. "Said they decided farming wasn't for them." Miller's expression was unreadable. That's one way of putting it. Elizabeth felt a chill at his tone. "What do you mean?" Miller seemed to choose his words carefully. "The Blackwoods were good people. John was a hard worker. Sarah was kind. Their children were well behaved. They came here with high hopes, just like you folks." "But," James prompted, "but something changed that first winter. They became different." John stopped coming to town for supplies. When spring came and we hadn't seen them for months, some of us rode out to check on them. Miller paused, staring into his coffee cup. The house was abandoned. No sign of where they'd gone or why. Their wagon was still in the barn. Most of their belongings still in the house. That's strange, Elizabeth said, thinking of the journal. Did they leave any indication of what happened? Miller shook his head. None that made sense. John had carved symbols all over the barn walls. Strange markings no one recognized. The house was in disarray, but there was no sign of violence or struggle. They just vanished. Emma and Thomas, who had been listening from the doorway, exchanged worried glances. The land agent didn't mention any of this, James said, frowning. I'm not surprised. Would have made the place harder to sell. Miller finished his coffee and stood. Listen, I'm not one for superstition. Probably they just couldn't handle the isolation, went mad with cabin fever, and wandered off. Happens out here sometimes. I just thought you should know. Before leaving, Miller added one final comment. If you folks need anything, don't hesitate to ride over. And if you notice anything strange, my door is always open. As Miller mounted his horse to leave, he leaned down to speak quietly to James. Elizabeth couldn't hear what was said, but she noticed James's expression darkened. When he returned inside, he refused to meet her questioning gaze. What did he tell you? She asked. James busied himself stoking the fire. Nothing of importance. Just mentioned that there's a storm coming. Said we should prepare for it. Elizabeth knew he was lying but decided not to press the issue in front of the children. Later, when Emma and Thomas were occupied with a game of checkers, she confronted him. What did Miller really say to you? James sighed, his shoulders slumping. He said that after the Blackwoods disappeared, no one would take this land. Several families tried over the years, but none stayed more than a few months. The last family left in such a hurry they didn't even pack their belongings. And why didn't he mention this in front of the children? Because he didn't want to frighten them with ghost stories, James snapped. And neither do I. This is our home now, Elizabeth. We've invested everything we have in this place. We can't afford to let superstition drive us away. After Miller departed, James tried to dismiss the story. The man was just trying to frighten us. Probably thinks he can get this place cheap if we decide to leave. I don't think so, Elizabeth said quietly. I found Sarah Blackwood's journal yesterday. Her last entries were disturbed, frightened. She wrote about hearing things in the walls. James's expression hardened. Why didn't you tell me? I'm telling you now, Elizabeth replied. James, what if something really did happen to them? What if we're in danger, too? This is nonsense, James snapped. There's nothing wrong with this house except that it needs work. The Blackwoods probably just couldn't handle frontier life and left in the night rather than face the shame of failure. Emma spoke up from the doorway. But father, what about the hidden room? Someone was living there. A vagrant, nothing more, James insisted. I won't have this family worked up over ghost stories and superstition. We've invested everything in this place. We can't afford to leave. The conversation ended there, but the seeds of fear had been planted. That night, as snow continued to fall outside, the family retired early, exhausted from the day's work and emotions. In the middle of the night, Thomas woke screaming. Elizabeth and James rushed to his room to find him sitting upright in bed, pointing at the corner. The thin man, he cried. He was watching me. James checked every corner of the room, finding nothing. It was just a nightmare, son. There's no one here. But Thomas was inconsolable. He was there. I saw him. He was so thin and tall, and his fingers were too long. The description sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine, remembering Sarah's journal entry about her daughter seeing a thin man. He can sleep with us tonight, Elizabeth decided, gathering Thomas into her arms. James didn't argue, though his expression showed his frustration as they left Thomas's room. Emma appeared in her doorway, her face pale. I heard it again, she whispered. Someone walking in the walls. The family spent the remainder of the night huddled in the master bedroom. none of them sleeping soundly. By morning, James' patience had worn thin. "This has to stop," he announced at breakfast. "We can't fall apart over every creak and shadow. This is an old house. It makes noises. End of story." Elizabeth bit back her retort, seeing the dark circles under James's eyes. He was afraid too, she realized, but couldn't admit it. The snow continued for 3 days, piling up against the house and isolating them further. During this time, the strange occurrences escalated. Items disappeared only to reappear in odd places. The scratching in the walls became louder, more deliberate. Twice more, Thomas woke screaming about the thin man. On the 3rd day, Elizabeth discovered something disturbing in the kitchen. A set of wet footprints that didn't belong to any of them leading from the pantry door to the wall where they simply stopped. The prints were elongated and narrow with distinct toe marks that didn't quite look human. "James!" she called, her voice shaking. "You need to see this." By the time James arrived, however, the footprints had dried, leaving only faint outlines that he dismissed as water Elizabeth herself had tracked in. "I know what I saw," she insisted. "Someone or something was in our kitchen." James rubbed his temples, a headache clearly building. "Elizabeth, please. We need to maintain our composure, especially in front of the children." But Elizabeth noticed how his eyes lingered on the wall where the footprints had led, and how he tested the solidity of the paneling with his knuckles when he thought she wasn't looking. That night, Elizabeth woke to find James' side of the bed empty. Alarmed, she grabbed her robe and went searching for him. She found him in Thomas's room, sitting in a chair, facing the small door he'd previously nailed shut. "James," she whispered, "what are you doing?" He started at her voice, turning with an expression of confusion. I thought I heard something. The scratching." "No, a voice." James ran a hand through his hair, clearly distressed. "I thought I heard someone calling my name." "The children are asleep," Elizabeth said. "I just checked on them." "It wasn't the children," James insisted. It sounded like a man, but not quite. The voice was wrong somehow. Too high, too stretched. Elizabeth felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. "Come back to bed, James. You're exhausted. You need rest." James allowed himself to be led from the room, but Elizabeth noticed how he kept glancing back at the small door as if expecting it to open at any moment. On the 4th day, the snow finally stopped, and James announced he needed to go into town for supplies. Elizabeth begged him not to leave them alone, but he insisted it was necessary. "We need flour, sugar, and more ammunition," he said, avoiding her eyes at the last item. "I'll be back before dark." "Please, James," Elizabeth pleaded, following him to the barn. "Take us with you. We could all use a trip to town." James shook his head as he saddled his horse. "The snow's too deep for the wagon, and I can't take all of you on horseback. Besides, someone needs to keep the fire going." "I won't be long, I promise." Elizabeth watched him ride away with a sense of foreboding. As soon as he disappeared into the treeline, she hurried back to the house, bolting the door behind her. "Where's Father going?" Emma asked, looking up from the book she'd been reading to Thomas. "For supplies," Elizabeth answered, trying to sound casual. "He'll be back before dark." Emma studied her mother's face. "You're worried. Just concerned about the weather," Elizabeth lied. "Now, who wants to help me inventory our preserves? We should know exactly what we need when your father returns." The busy work kept them occupied for a while, but Elizabeth couldn't shake her unease. The house seemed different with James gone, the shadows deeper, the sounds from within the walls more frequent. Even Emma, who had maintained a brave face through most of their ordeal, jumped at the occasional thump or scratch that emanated from behind the plaster. After James departed, Elizabeth decided to continue her investigation. While the children played checkers by the fire, she returned to the kitchen cupboard where she'd found Sarah's journal, searching for any other hidden items. Finding nothing, she turned her attention to the rest of the house. In the parlor, she noticed something odd about the fireplace mantle. One side seemed slightly thicker than the other. Pressing against it, she felt it give slightly. After several minutes of manipulation, a small compartment popped open, revealing a folded piece of paper. The note was written in the same handwriting as Sarah's journal, but more frantic and barely legible. If you find this, leave this place. They live in the walls and floors. They've been here since before the house was built. They want us to join them. John doesn't believe me, but I've seen them at night. Thin and pale with fingers like twigs. They whisper to the children. Mary talks back to them now. I fear what will happen when the snow melts and the ground thaws. Whatever is buried beneath this house is waking up. Elizabeth's hands shook as she refolded the note. Sarah Blackwood hadn't been suffering from cabin fever or isolation-induced madness. She'd been genuinely terrified. A sudden crash from upstairs jolted Elizabeth from her thoughts. She rushed to the staircase, calling out for the children. We're still down here, Mother? Emma answered from the parlor, looking confused. The three of them climbed the stairs together, following the sound to Thomas's room. The small door James had nailed shut now stood open. The nails pulled free and scattered across the floor. I nailed that shut, Elizabeth whispered, backing away and pulling the children with her. Perhaps Father opened it before he left, Emma suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Elizabeth shook her head. He wouldn't have. Not without telling me. They retreated downstairs, Elizabeth keeping the children close as she considered their options. They couldn't leave on foot in the deep snow, especially with night approaching. Their only choice was to wait for James to return and then insist they leave immediately, even if it meant abandoning most of their possessions. As dusk fell, Elizabeth barricaded the doors and windows as best she could, keeping the rifle close at hand. The children sat huddled together by the fire, jumping at every sound. The scratching in the walls had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. When is Father coming back? Thomas asked repeatedly. Soon, Elizabeth assured him, though she was growing increasingly worried. James should have returned hours ago. Night fell and still James didn't return. Elizabeth kept the lamps burning, fighting against the encroaching darkness. The children eventually fell into an uneasy sleep on the sofa while Elizabeth maintained her vigil by the window, watching the moonlit snow for any sign of James. Emma woke shortly before midnight, joining her mother at the window. He should have been back by now, she said softly. Elizabeth put an arm around her daughter's shoulders. The snow is deep. He might have decided to stay in town rather than risk the journey back after dark. You don't believe that? Emma observed. You're afraid something's happened to him. Elizabeth sighed. Emma had always been perceptive, too intelligent to be fooled by comforting lies. I am worried, she admitted. But your father is resourceful. He'll find his way back to us. And if he doesn't, then we'll wait until morning and find a way to reach the Millers. We won't stay here alone. Emma nodded, seemingly satisfied with this plan. She was about to return to the sofa when she suddenly gripped her mother's arm. Mother, look! Elizabeth followed her daughter's pointing finger. At the edge of the tree line, a figure had emerged, moving awkwardly toward the house. It's Father, Emma exclaimed, relief evident in her voice. But as the figure drew closer, Elizabeth's relief turned to confusion, then horror. It was James, but he was moving strangely, as if his limbs weren't quite under his control. His normally purposeful stride had been replaced by a jerky, unnatural gait. And he wasn't alone. Shadowy figures flanked him, so thin they almost disappeared when they turned sideways, their long-fingered hands guiding James toward the house. Get away from the window, Elizabeth whispered urgently, pulling Emma back. But it's Father. That's not your father, Elizabeth said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. It was James, but something was terribly wrong with him. Wake your brother, Elizabeth instructed, retrieving the rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Quietly, Emma did as she was told, gently rousing Thomas without alarming him. Elizabeth peered cautiously through the window again. James and his strange companions had reached the yard, their progress slow but steady through the deep snow. Now that they were closer, Elizabeth could see that the thin figures were even more disturbing than she'd first thought. Their bodies were elongated and jointed in all the wrong places, their heads too large for their skeletal frames. They moved with a terrible grace, like insects walking on delicate legs. Elizabeth backed away from the window, her heart pounding. She grabbed the rifle, checking that it was loaded before gathering the children. "We need to hide," she whispered urgently. "Now, is Father back?" Thomas asked sleepily. "Yes, but something's wrong. We need to hide until I can help him." Emma, instantly alert, took Thomas's hand. "Where?" Elizabeth thought frantically. The cellar was too obvious, and she had no desire to go deeper into the house. The barn was too far to reach safely. "The attic," she decided quickly and quietly. They crept upstairs, Elizabeth leading the way with the rifle. In the master bedroom, a small hatch in the ceiling led to the attic. James had investigated it their first day, declaring it empty except for dust and old trunks. Elizabeth pushed a chair beneath the hatch and climbed up, helping the children after her. The attic was dark and cold, but offered hiding places among the abandoned trunks and furniture. She closed the hatch behind them just as they heard the front door open downstairs. "Elizabeth," James's voice called out, sounding normal enough to make her doubt what she'd seen. "Children, where are you?" Thomas started to answer, but Elizabeth clamped a hand over his mouth, shaking her head vehemently. Something was wrong with James. The way he had moved outside, the shadowy figures guiding him. Whatever had happened to the Blackwoods was happening to them now. James's voice continued, the tone becoming increasingly desperate. "Elizabeth, please, I need help." The pleading tone nearly broke Elizabeth's resolve. What if she was wrong? What if James had merely been struggling through the snow and the strange figures were just tricks of the moonlight and her overwrought imagination? But then the voice changed, taking on that strange sing-song quality that raised the hair on Elizabeth's neck. "I know you're here," James called, no longer sounding like himself at all. "The others want to meet you. They've been waiting so long." Footsteps moved through the house below, methodical and searching. Elizabeth held the children close as they huddled behind a large trunk, the rifle across her lap. "They've been here for centuries," the whisper said. "Long before the house. They live in the earth beneath. They're so hungry for company." The footsteps reached the second floor, moving from room to room. Elizabeth could hear James talking, sometimes in his own voice, sometimes in a whisper that didn't sound like him at all. "The Blackwoods weren't suitable," James's voice continued conversationally. "Too resistant, but we will be perfect. I've already joined them, Elizabeth. It's wonderful. No more worry. No more struggle. I don't like this game anymore," Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I want Father back." "Hush, sweetheart," Elizabeth soothed, though her own voice trembled. "We need to be very quiet now." The bedroom door creaked open. Elizabeth could hear James moving around below, searching. "The children will adapt quickly," he continued. "Children always do. You're the only question mark, Elizabeth. Will you join willingly, or will we need to persuade you?" A long silence followed, broken only by the sound of James pacing the room. Then abruptly, he stopped directly beneath the attic hatch. "Ah," he said softly, "there you are." The hatch began to rattle as something pushed against it from below. Elizabeth aimed the rifle, her finger trembling on the trigger. She couldn't shoot James. But was it really James anymore? The hatch flew open, and James's face appeared, his eyes unnaturally wide and gleaming in the darkness. Behind him, Elizabeth caught glimpses of the thin figures, their elongated limbs and two large heads hovering just out of clear sight. "Come down, Elizabeth," James said, his voice distorted. "The others want to meet you." Elizabeth raised the rifle. "James, if you're still in there, fight this. Remember who you are." James's expression flickered for a moment, confusion replacing the eerie smile. "Elizabeth, what's happening?" "They've done something to you," Elizabeth said desperately. "The things in the walls. You need to fight them." James' face contorted in pain. "Run," he gasped, his voice momentarily his own. Take the children and run." Then his expression smoothed out, returning to the unnatural calm. "There's nowhere to run to," the other voice said, using James's mouth. "This land is ours. The house is merely a convenience." As James began to pull himself up into the attic, Elizabeth made a split-second decision. Shoving the children toward the far end of the attic, she fired the rifle into the floor near the hatch, not aiming to hit James, but to startle him and create a distraction. The plan worked. James fell back in surprise, and Elizabeth used the moment to slam the hatch shut, dragging a heavy trunk over it. "The back window," she hissed to the children, pointing to a small window at the rear of the attic that overlooked the sloped roof of the kitchen extension. "We can climb down from there." Emma moved quickly, forcing the window open despite years of paint sealing it shut. Below, they could hear James recovering, pounding on the hatch and calling to them in that horrible not his voice. "I'll go first," Elizabeth decided, handing the rifle to Emma. "Then Thomas, then you. We'll make for the barn. There's a sled there we can use to get away." The drop from the window to the kitchen roof was only a few feet, but climbing out in the dark was terrifying. Elizabeth managed it, then helped Thomas through. As Emma was passing the rifle out, the trunk barricading the hatch suddenly slid aside with unnatural force. James emerged, but it was immediately clear that whatever was controlling him had taken firmer hold. His movements were jerky and wrong, his head tilting at an impossible angle. Behind him, the thin figures were more visible now, their elongated limbs and skeletal forms moving with a terrible grace. "Emma!" Elizabeth screamed as one of the figures reached for her daughter. Emma fired the rifle without hesitation, the bullet splintering the attic floor between James and the creatures. It gave her the moment she needed to dive through the window, nearly falling off the roof in her haste. The three Crawfords scrambled down from the kitchen roof using a drain pipe to reach the ground. The snow was deep, slowing their progress as they fled toward the barn. "Don't look back," Elizabeth gasped as they ran. "Just keep moving." But Thomas couldn't help himself. He glanced over his shoulder and immediately stumbled, falling face first into the snow. "They're coming!" he cried, his voice breaking with terror. Elizabeth turned to see James emerging from the house, the thin figures flowing around him like dark water. They moved with impossible speed across the snow, barely leaving footprints despite their height. "Get up," Elizabeth urged, pulling Thomas to his feet. "We have to keep moving." In the barn, Elizabeth found the sled James had repaired the previous week, hurriedly hitching their remaining horse to it, while Emma stood guard with the rifle. "Where will we go?" Thomas asked, his teeth chattering from cold and fear. "To the miller's," Elizabeth decided. "It's our only chance." As they prepared to leave, the barn doors flew open. James stood there, the thin figures moving like shadows behind him. "Please stay," he said, his voice a chilling blend of his own and something inhuman. "We can be together forever." "That's not my father," Emma whispered, raising the rifle. Elizabeth put a hand on the barrel, lowering it gently. "We can't shoot him, Emma. He's still in there somewhere." Instead, Elizabeth grabbed a lantern hanging nearby, smashing it against the barn wall. Kerosene spilled across the straw-covered floor, igniting instantly. The flame spread rapidly, creating a barrier between them and James. "Go!" Elizabeth screamed, pushing the children onto the sled. As they drove away, Elizabeth looked back to see James standing amid the growing flames, unmoving, the thin figures retreating from the fire. For a moment, James' expression cleared, and he seemed to recognize them. He raised a hand in farewell, a sad smile crossing his face before the smoke obscured him. The journey to the miller's farm was harrowing. The horse struggled through deep snow, and twice they heard unearthly howls behind them that made the animal rear in terror. Once Thomas claimed he saw thin figures moving through the trees parallel to their path, but the darkness made it impossible to be certain. As they crested a hill, Elizabeth felt a momentary surge of hope at the sight of lights in the distance, the Miller homestead. But then she noticed something odd about the way the horse was behaving. Its ears laid back flat against its head, nostrils flaring in terror. "Something's wrong?" Emma whispered, following her mother's gaze. The snow ahead of them began to move as if something was pushing up from beneath. A thin hand, unnaturally elongated with too many joints, broke through the white surface, followed by another and another. "They're coming up from the ground," Thomas whimpered. Elizabeth snapped the reins, urging the horse forward. But the animal reared in panic, nearly overturning the sled. The thin figures were emerging all around them now, their skeletal forms rising from the snow like grotesque plants unfurling toward the moonlight. "We have to run for it," Elizabeth decided, grabbing Thomas. "Emma, bring the rifle. Stay close." They abandoned the sled, plunging through the deep snow toward the distant lights of the Miller farm. Each step was exhausting, the snow reaching past their knees in places. Thomas stumbled repeatedly, forcing Elizabeth to half drag, half carry him. Behind them, the horse screamed, a terrible human-like sound that cut off abruptly. Elizabeth didn't look back, focusing solely on the lights ahead, pulling her children forward through sheer force of will. "We're almost there," she gasped, though the distance seemed impossible to cover with the thin ones closing in behind them. A gunshot rang out, startling Elizabeth. She turned to see Emma had stopped, the rifle raised to her shoulder. "They're too close," Emma said, her young face set with determination as she fired again at the approaching figures. "Keep going. I'll hold them off." "No," Elizabeth cried, reaching for her daughter. "We stay together." Emma hesitated just long enough for Elizabeth to grab her arm, pulling her forward. They continued their desperate flight, the lights of the Miller homestead growing tantalizingly closer. "Help!" Elizabeth screamed as they approached. "Please help us." The front door of the farmhouse opened, spilling warm light across the snow. Robert Miller appeared, shotgun in hand, his wife behind him holding a lantern. "Run!" he shouted, raising his shotgun toward the darkness behind them. With their last reserves of strength, the Crawfords staggered toward the house. Miller fired past them, the shotgun blast momentarily illuminating the night and the thin figures that had almost reached them, their elongated limbs stretching out like insect legs, their two large heads bobbing atop skeletal frames. "Inside quickly," Miller's wife urged, pulling them through the door as her husband continued firing. Miller backed into the house, slamming and bolting the door behind him. "Upstairs," he directed, his face grim. "They don't like to be off the ground." The Millers hustled the exhausted Crawfords up to the second floor, where a fire burned cheerfully in the hearth of a small sitting room. Mrs. Miller wrapped them in blankets while her husband kept watch at the window, shotgun ready. "They're retreating," he reported after a tense silence. "At least for now." "What are they?" Elizabeth asked, her voice hollow. Miller shook his head. "No one knows for certain. The Indians avoided that land long before white settlers arrived. They said the earth there was thin, that things could cross over from somewhere else. Things that want to be human but can't manage it on their own. They took James," Emma said, tears finally breaking through her stoic facade. "They made him like them." Miller's expression softened with sympathy. "I should have warned you more clearly when I visited. But who would believe such things?" "I saw them up close," Thomas whispered. "They had too many bones in their arms and legs and their faces." He trailed off, shuddering. "Don't think about it now," Mrs. Miller soothed, placing a cup of hot tea in his hands. "You're safe here." "James," Elizabeth whispered. "Could he still be?" "I don't know," Miller admitted, "but we'll go back at first light, armed and prepared, if he survived the fire." But they never had the chance to find out. That night, a fierce blizzard descended, the worst in living memory, according to the Millers. For 3 days, the snow fell without cessation, making travel impossible. When it finally cleared, a group of men from the nearest town joined Miller and Elizabeth to investigate. They found the farmhouse and barn reduced to charred ruins. The fire had spread from the barn to the house, consuming both completely. Of James, there was no sign, no body, no remains of any kind. The fire wouldn't have burned hot enough to leave nothing, one of the men muttered. There should be something left. As they searched the property, Elizabeth noticed something strange about the ground where the house had stood. The snow there was melting rapidly, revealing scorched earth beneath. But more disturbing were the holes, dozens of them, each about the size of a fist, dotting the ground where the foundation had been. Like burrows, Miller observed, keeping Elizabeth back. Going deep into the earth. One of the men bent to examine the holes more closely. Something came out of these, he said, pointing to disturbed soil around the openings. Or went in. Elizabeth felt a wave of horror wash over her. We need to leave, she said urgently. Now. No one argued. They retreated to their horses, but as Elizabeth mounted, she heard Thomas call out from where he waited with Emma by the road. Father! Elizabeth's head snapped up. At the edge of the forest stood a figure that resembled James. But even at this distance, she could tell something was wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the posture too stiff. Beside him stood other figures, thin, elongated shapes that seemed to waver in and out of visibility. Go! Miller shouted, spurring his horse. The group fled, but as they rode away, Elizabeth looked back one last time. The James thing raised a hand in farewell, exactly as the real James had done during their escape. Beside him, one of the thin figures mimicked the gesture. Its two long fingers splayed awkwardly. The Crawfords never returned to Montana. With Miller's help, Elizabeth sold the land at a significant loss to a logging company that planned to clear-cut the forest. She didn't warn them about what lurked beneath the soil. Perhaps she should have, but who would have believed her? They settled in California, as far from Montana as they could manage. Elizabeth never remarried, devoting herself to raising Emma and Thomas. The children gradually recovered from their ordeal, though Thomas